I want to write about the difficulty I've had working on projects that make no sense. I've worked on several. For example, the DQ project. The aim of the project was to digitize a multi-stage administrative process. But the project was nonsense for a lot of reasons. Number one, there was an insistence that all the software development be done on a remote development environment for reasons of security. Maybe that doesn't sound so crazy. Maybe it wouldn't have been if it hadn't been for number two. Internet connectivity was extremely poor. It was common for the developers to lose their connection to the virtual environment, and sometimes for the developers to lose code that they'd been developing on the virtual environment. Why weren't the developers regularly submitting their code to the repository? Well, number three, commits to the code repository had to go through a code reviewing tool, Gerrit. As part of the code review process, someone other than the developer who had submitted the code had to approve the code, saying that it met coding standards. We didn't have any coding standards. Actually, we had a dress code, no jeans in the office, but no coding standards. Number four. There was also an insistence that all the code that was written should go through a code checking program, SonarQube, as part of the build. Some of the rules that the code quality checker used weren't relevant to what we were writing. They would always fail. We couldn't get code into the build if this code checking program didn't go green. But we couldn't get permission to change the file that contains the rules. Number five. Development was supposed to be done on an agreed software stack. No agreement to my knowledge was ever made about the software stack. Number six. There were no spoons in the kitchen. Number seven. At one point, the software review tool, that was a mandatory step of the process for submitting code to the repository, disappeared for several days. When we asked why, we were told it was part of scheduled maintenance. Number eight. Because of a dispute between the organisation that we were working for and one of their target groups of customers, we were forbidden from talking to these customers, potential users of the system. Number nine. The ops people that we were talking to weren't familiar with Agile. They wanted to generate all the documentation that was required for an old school waterfall release for every story in the backlog. Not every code release, every story. I counted. That meant the creation of 22 documents for every story. Number 10. It was a multi-vendor environment. The people who were supplying the servers were different from the people who were doing the architecture. People from multiple vendors were on different development teams. Some of the team members who were being supplied by some of the suppliers had completely the wrong skills. We were working in a Unix environment. Some of the suppliers sent us people who were Windows specialists. We had to ask several people to be removed from our teams simply because they didn't know anything about the technology we were using. Number 11. We were forbidden from using cloud services like Amazon because they weren't security approved. But because of the code review, the code checking, and the documentation, to get anything out of the development environment into a production environment was nearly impossible. This, combined with a poor Wi-Fi, made it extremely tempting to use private cloud environments to make progress. All the teams were using cloud services on private accounts. Number 12. The head of UI wore wacky glasses and a jalaba. He was a white guy. One of his first moves when he arrived was to pull all the UI people out of the cross-functional, multi-skilled teams they were in and make them sit with him. The lead architect, who never seemed to do anything, had a ponytail and wore sandals. The only thing I can remember him saying is that the London Underground system didn't emerge piecemeal, but was the result of a big upfront design. If there's a more false statement than that, I don't want to hear it. Somebody seemed to be hiring people to cosplay the senior roles, who talk nonsense. 13. About 3 months into the project, one of the architects, he wasn't the lead architect, he was one of the architects who actually did things, decided that we were going to use a different architectural approach from the one that we'd been using up to then. This meant that pretty much all the work that we'd been doing up to then needed to be reworked. Number 14. None of these problems, not one of them, stop senior management from insisting that progress continue to be made in development, even though most of these issues just on their own would have been enough to stop development stone dead. 15. One senior Agile coach, who had sold into the project an entire team of Agile coaches, said at one of the all-hands meetings, "We're going to have no problem meeting the target for delivery. All we have to do is double our velocity." 16. At that same all-hands meeting, the project's communication director ably demonstrated that he didn't know the difference between an acronym and an anagram. Here's part of what I think was going on. The company or companies that had been contracted to provide servers hadn't got specifications for the servers until very late, so they were late providing servers. I'm also wondering if they either hadn't got the memo about this being an Agile project, or because ops people who knew about Agile were hard and expensive to come by, they just hadn't bothered trying. All of this meant that they had absolutely no incentive to give us access to those servers because they didn't exist. The team who were doing this work were close to the internal IT team, so they encouraged the internal IT team in their efforts to create safeguards like the SonarQube code checking step, the one where the rules couldn't be changed, and the code review step. Long story short, nobody beyond the development team was incentivized to speed up or streamline the process of getting code onto a light life server. In fact, nobody beyond the development team seemed to be incentivized to get any code at all onto the light life server. There didn't seem to be anyone that we could see visible within the organization that we could talk to, who could speed up the Wi-Fi. Eventually it did speed up. We were never sure how it happened, but it happened after we created the Wi-Fi wall of shame, an area of wall where I encouraged the developers to write on a post-it with a date every time they had an outage on their network connection. Why did I mention spoons? Because every week we had a meeting of Scrum Masters with a senior delivery manager to talk about the list of issues that we had. This was pretty much the list that I've given here, and for several weeks, top of that list, the thing that we talked about first, because presumably in the mind of someone it was the most important, was spoons. This was until one of my fellow Scrum Masters finally realised that he'd had enough, tilted his head back, and in a high-pitched chattering whine, screamed that he never wanted to hear about spoons again. I left the project 6 months afterwards. The Scrum Master who'd lost his temper about spoons got thrown off the project 3 months later. His crime? Producing a demonstrable prototype, but on an unauthorised platform.